In the summer of 1873, a man dressed entirely in black stepped through the swinging doors of a saloon in a dying cattle town called Red Hollow, Texas. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, his frame cut lean and hard by years of hunger and violence. His skin was dark as a moonless night. His eyes carried something that made men who had faced stampedes and gunfights suddenly feel uneasy. Conversations faltered. Cards paused mid-deal. Glasses hovered near lips and never quite reached them. Within 60 seconds of entering the room, the man drew his revolver and put a single bullet through the skull of a ranch hand named Caleb Turner. Before anyone could scream, before anyone could reach for a gun, the stranger turned and walked back out into the white heat of the Texas afternoon, disappearing as if the earth itself had opened to swallow him. That one gunshot echoed across Texas for the next 2 years. It was the first note in a long, deliberate campaign of vengeance that would leave 18 men dead. It was the announcement that something the South believed it had buried had returned to collect debts long ignored. Newspapers would later call the shooter a monster. Wanted posters would label him dangerous and inhuman. But among the black families, who still remembered the old days, who still carried scars both visible and hidden, he was called something else. They called him Judgment. To understand how Elijah Boone became the most feared gunslinger in Texas, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to his birth, but to his mother's death. That was the moment the boy named Elijah ceased to exist and something harder took his place. The year was 1859. The place was a cotton plantation known as Ashcroft Fields, 40 miles east of San Antonio. Its owner was a man named Preston Ashcroft. He liked to be called Colonel Ashcroft, though he had never worn a uniform or fought in any war. In the South, wealth often came with invented titles, and no one challenged men who owned land, money, and human beings. Ashcroft Fields covered nearly 3,000 acres and held over 100 enslaved souls. Newspapers praised Preston Ashcroft as a model of Southern success. What they did not print were the screams that carried across the fields at dawn, or the unmarked graves behind the quarters, or the families split apart with nothing more than a handshake and a price. Elijah was born on that plantation in 1848. His mother's name was Ruth. She worked in the big house, scrubbing floors until her hands cracked, cooking meals she was never allowed to taste, moving quietly through white rooms where her existence was barely acknowledged unless something went wrong. Among the enslaved, Ruth was known for her gentleness and her voice. She sang while she worked, old hymns passed down through generations, songs about deliverance and memory and a God who saw what men pretended not to see. Elijah grew up wrapped in that sound. It was the only softness he knew. She gave him his name in whispers. Late at night in the slave cabin they shared with several other families, Elijah. She told him it meant that the Lord remembered, that nothing done in darkness stayed hidden forever. She pressed those words into him as if they were armor, something he might one day need. Elijah's father was sold south to Louisiana when Elijah was 4. The boy remembered only the sound of his mother crying into the dirt after the wagon disappeared down the road. No one told her where he had been taken. That was not information. Masters felt obligated to provide. From that day forward, Elijah learned that love could be removed without warning and without explanation. By the time he was 6, Elijah worked from sunrise to dusk. He carried water, gathered eggs, fetched tools, ran messages. The Ashcroft children sometimes amused themselves by throwing stones at him. If he cried, he was punished. If he ran, the punishment was worse. He learned to keep his face still. That was his first survival skill. The head overseer on Ashcroft Fields was a man named Silas Crow. He came from nothing and found purpose in cruelty. He carried a whip threaded with metal tips, and he used it often. Crow believed pain was the language slaves understood best. He smiled when he worked. Elijah noticed that early. He noticed everything. The day Ruth died was a Tuesday in late August. The heat pressed down so hard it felt like breathing through cloth. She was carrying a jug of milk across the kitchen floor when her hand slipped. The jug shattered. Milk spilled across polished wood. Mrs. Ashcroft screamed, not from injury but from offense. Something of hers had been broken by someone she considered less than human. Silas Crow was called. Elijah heard his mother scream and ran without thinking. He rounded the corner of the house and saw her tied to a post behind the kitchen, her dress torn away. Crow standing behind her with his whip. Mrs. Ashcroft watched from the shade, fanning herself. Preston Ashcroft stood beside her, bored. Crow struck Ruth again and again. Elijah tried to reach her. Another overseer held him back. "Watch," the man said. "This is what happens." Elijah watched every blow. He counted them, 36, 37. He watched his mother's screams fade into silence. He watched her body sag. When it was over, they left her there. She died that night from blood loss and infection. Elijah was not allowed to see her buried. The next morning he was sent to the fields. Something inside him went quiet then. He did not cry, he did not beg. He worked. That night, lying in the place where his mother had slept, Elijah made a promise to himself. He would remember every face, every name. And one day, when he was strong enough, he would make them remember him. The years that followed hardened him. He was whipped often. He did not break. Silas Crow noticed the look in his eyes and once said Elijah would need to be sold before he grew into a problem. In 1860, Preston Ashcroft sold Elijah's younger sister, Mary. She was 6. Elijah watched her disappear down the road in a trader's wagon, screaming his name. He added 2 more names to his list that day. When the war came, nothing changed. For the enslaved at Ashcroft Fields except the fear of their masters. Talk of freedom was punished. Escape was met with death. The final breaking point came the night Elijah's only friend, a boy named Jonah, was hanged for stealing bread. 3 days later, Elijah ran. By the time he walked into the saloon at Red Hollow in 1873, the boy who had once believed his mother's songs was long dead. What remained was something shaped by memory, sharpened by patience, and fueled by a promise that had never been forgotten. Elijah ran west without a plan, without supplies, without anything except the clothes on his back and the names burned into his memory. He crawled under the fence at the far edge of Ashcroft Fields and kept moving always west, away from the cotton rows and the man-made hell that had been his entire world. He was 13 years old. He had never been farther than the edge of the plantation. He did not know how to hunt or read maps or navigate towns. He only knew that if he stayed, he would die a slave, and if he ran, at least the dying would be his own. The first 3 nights were a blur of terror and exhaustion. He moved only after sunset, slipping through brush and dry creek beds, freezing at every sound. During the day he hid, curled beneath mesquite trees or wedged into gullies, where the sun could not reach him. He drank from muddy streams and ate whatever berries he could find, praying they would not kill him. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, a sharp animal pain that made his vision blur and his thoughts slow. On the 4th day he heard the dogs. The sound carried across the land in long, baying cries that turned his blood cold. Ashcroft had hired slave hunters, men who made their living dragging runaways back in chains. They rode horses, they carried rifles. They owned hounds bred to follow a human scent for miles. Elijah knew what would happen if they caught him. At best, he would be whipped and sold south to the sugar plantations where men were worked until they dropped. At worst, he would hang like Jonah. He ran anyway. His lungs burned. His legs trembled. He stumbled into a dry creek bed and collapsed. The dogs were closer now. He could hear men shouting, hooves striking stone. Panic clawed at his throat. That was when he saw the hole. It was small, hidden beneath roots and dead leaves, barely large enough for a boy. Elijah forced himself inside, scraping skin, holding his breath as the dogs arrived. They circled, confused. The water had stolen his scent. The men cursed it and moved on. Elijah stayed hidden until nightfall. When he crawled back into the open air, he was shaking, filthy, and alive. For the next 3 years, Elijah survived in the wild stretches of West Texas. This was not the plantation South. This was open land where law thinned out and survival answered to no one. He learned by nearly dying. He learned which plants fed you and which killed you. He learned to follow animals to water, to build traps from wire and bone, to light fire without smoke. He learned that the land did not care what color his skin was, it only demanded respect. People were different. He encountered outlaws hiding from warrants, traders crossing borders, hunters who saw a lone black boy as easy profit. Some tried to help him, some tried to sell him. 2 men tried to chain him. One of them did not survive the encounter. Elijah felt nothing when it happened. No guilt, no triumph. Just relief. Violence came easier after that. By 15, Elijah was lean and sharp, more animal than child. He slept lightly. He watched everything. The softness his mother had nurtured retreated deep inside him, sealed away where it could not be used against him. In the spring of 1864, fever nearly killed him. He stumbled into a canyon and collapsed beside a fire belonging to an old man with gray hair and a scarred face. The man did not draw his gun. He watched. The man's name was Mateo Rojas. Mateo had once been a legend along the border, a gunfighter who had ridden with bandits and rebels who had fought Americans and Mexicans alike, depending on who had wronged him last. By the time Elijah found him, Mateo was tired. He had faked his death and vanished into the mountains, trying to outrun the ghosts he had made. He fed Elijah. He let him stay. When Elijah told his story, Mateo listened without interruption. When it was done, Mateo told him the truth. Hate alone would get him killed. Skill would keep him alive. Training began the next morning. Mateo taught Elijah how to fight with hands, knives, sticks, and anything that could be turned into a weapon. He taught him how to shoot until drawing and firing became a single motion. He taught him to think before acting, to wait, to plan. He taught him that revenge was not rage, it was patience. 4 years passed. By the time Elijah left the mountains, he was no longer running. He was returning. The war was over. Slavery was dead in name if not in spirit. Men like Silas Crow and Preston Ashcroft had scattered, trying to blend into a new world that did not want to look too closely at what they had done. Elijah began with Crow. He found him in Red Hollow, drinking away his wages, boasting about the old days. Elijah watched him for a week. He learned his habits. On a blazing afternoon, he walked into the saloon. The shot was clean. By the time Crow hit the floor, Elijah was already gone. The legend started there. Some called him a demon. Some said he was justice given flesh. Posters went up. Bounties rose. Elijah did not slow down. He moved from town to town, crossing names off his list with the same calm precision. Each killing was deliberate, each message clear. When he reached Preston Ashcroft years later, Elijah did not kill him. He did something worse. He left him alive with nothing. And then Elijah Boone disappeared, leaving behind a story men told. In whispers, and mothers told their children when they wanted them to remember that some debts do not vanish with time. The boy who had watched his mother die was gone. What remained was memory. Ashcroft lived after that night, but not as a man. Elijah made sure of it. The old plantation owner was found wandering the burned remains of his estate at dawn, barefoot and raving, clutching at ghosts only he could see. The doctors later said his mind had fractured under fear. He was sent north to an asylum, where he spent the rest of his days screaming about a boy in black who stood at the foot of his bed and watched him sleep. He died there in 1881, alone, unmourned, his name already fading from the world he once ruled. Elijah did not stay to see it. The killing stopped after Ashcroft. The towns expected more blood. They waited for another name, another execution, another body left as a reminder. It did not come. Weeks passed, then months. The man they called. Judgment vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. Some believed he had finally been caught. Others said he had crossed into Mexico. A few whispered that he had never existed at all, that frightened men had invented him to explain deaths they preferred not to examine too closely. But among black families, the story did not fade. It changed. It grew quieter, more careful. Names were altered, places blurred. The meaning stayed the same. They said Elijah went back west, into the mountains where Mateo Rojas had once lived alone with his memories. They said the cabin was still standing, the garden overgrown but alive. They said Elijah found Mateo buried there beneath a simple marker, the old gunfighter finally claimed by time rather than bullets. They said Elijah buried him properly with his own hands and stayed for a while sitting by the fire in silence, listening to the wind move through the canyon. No one knows how long he remained there. Some said years. Some said he never left. Others claimed he traveled again, but differently this time. No longer hunting, no longer killing. They said when slave catchers or hired thugs came looking for freedmen who had fallen into debt traps or false charges, sometimes they vanished. Sometimes chains were found cut clean through. Sometimes men woke up bruised and terrified with no memory of what had happened, only the certainty that something had watched them and decided they were not worth killing yet. Elijah never used his name again. Names had power, and he had learned what happened when power was misused. He became a shadow, a rumor, a warning passed quietly from one mouth to another. He did not seek recognition. He did not seek forgiveness. He did not seek peace. Peace, Mateo had once told him, was a luxury for men who had not been shaped by violence. Elijah understood that now. At night, when the world was quiet, the past still came for him. He saw his mother's back split open beneath the whip. He heard Mary screaming his name as the wagon rolled away. He saw Jonah's feet kicking against the empty air. No amount of blood had erased those images. No amount of skill or discipline had silenced them. They lived inside him, permanent and sharp. But something else lived there too, memory, the thing his mother had tried to give him before the world took everything else. Elijah understood that the men he had killed were small compared to the system that had created them. Slavery had not been an accident. It had been organized, justified, protected by law and scripture and tradition. When it ended on paper, the men who built their lives on it were rarely punished. They adapted. They found new ways to extract labor, to control bodies, to profit from suffering. The violence changed its shape, but not its purpose. Elijah had never believed he could fix that. He had only believed in remembering. In some versions of the story, Elijah lived long enough to see railroads cut across the land where cotton once grew. He saw towns rise and fall. He saw black men vote, then watch that right be stripped away again through quieter means. He saw children born free who still learned fear early. He said little, he listened much. People who met him late in life described a man with calm eyes and careful movements. He carried himself like someone who had once been dangerous and chosen to stop. He worked with his hands. He helped when asked. He vanished when attention turned toward him. They never knew who he had been. That was by design. Elijah Boone died the way he had lived since leaving the mountains, without witnesses, without ceremony. Some said he was buried beneath a cottonwood tree near a river that ran west. Others said there was no grave at all. Only the land knew where. He rested, and the land was good at keeping secrets. What remained was the story. A story about a boy who learned too young what cruelty looked like. A boy who watched the people he loved destroyed by men who never believed they would be held accountable. A boy who ran into the wilderness and survived when survival itself was an act of defiance. A man who returned not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a reminder. The story was never really about revenge. Revenge was only the surface. Beneath it was something heavier. The refusal to forget. The insistence that suffering mattered, even when the law said it did not. The belief that memory itself could be a weapon. Elijah's mother had whispered a truth into the dark that night when she named him. She believed someone, somewhere, kept count. That no scream was wasted. That no life was truly erased. Elijah carried that belief into a world that tried very hard to bury it. And now the story carries it forward. Because remembering is not passive, it is a choice, it is an act. It is the quiet decision not to look away, even when forgetting would be easier. That is what Elijah Boone left behind. Not a trail of bodies, a warning and a question. If the forgotten return, if the silence speak, if memory refuses to die, what kind of world will we build in response? That answer, unlike Elijah, has never disappeared. The story did not end when Elijah vanished. Stories like his never do. They sink into the ground and wait. They travel quietly, passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, generation to generation, changing shape but never substance. In the years after his disappearance, Texas tried to forget, towns rebuilt. New names replaced old ones on signs and deeds. Men who had once enforced chains became businessmen, sheriffs, church elders. They learned which parts of the past could be spoken aloud, and which had to be buried. Official records were neat and bloodless, dates, laws, amendments, progress, but memory does not obey paperwork. In certain towns, when a former overseer drank too much and bragged too loudly, the room would grow quiet. Someone would cough. Someone would leave. Old men would stare into their glasses and remember a black figure standing calmly in a doorway, waiting, patient as time itself. Mothers warned their sons not to boast about cruelty. Not because it was wrong, many still believe. It was necessary, but because someone, somewhere, might still be listening. There were men who spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. They never said his name. Some nights Elijah dreamed of the plantation as it had been before the fire. The rows endless, the air thick with heat and despair. In those dreams, he was small again, his hands bleeding, his mother singing softly to keep him from breaking. He always woke before the whip fell. He always woke before he could change anything. Other nights he dreamed of the canyon, of quiet, of wind moving through stone, of a fire that did not demand anything from him except attention. Those were the nights he slept deeply. He never dreamed of the men he killed. They were already gone long before he pulled the trigger. Once, many years later, a young man found him camped near a river and asked if the stories were true. Elijah looked at him for a long time before answering. The boy was barely 20, full of anger, his fists clenched even at rest. He wanted permission. He wanted a blueprint. Elijah shook his head. The boy did not understand and left angry. That was fine. Elijah had not lied. The stories were never instructions. They were cautions. Violence was not a door. It was a tunnel, and tunnels collapse. Elijah knew that better than anyone. He carried the weight of every choice he had made. Not with regret, exactly, but with awareness. There were moments when he wondered who he might have been if Ruth had lived, if Mary had grown beside him. If Jonah had stolen nothing more than a moment of hope, that man never existed. Mourning him would change nothing. What mattered was that the truth survived. That slavery was not an abstract evil. It had names, it had addresses. It had routines, it had men who laughed while they worked. Men who prayed on Sunday and whipped on Monday. Men who lived long, comfortable lives without consequence, except once. Once, memory took form. That was enough to unsettle a system built on forgetting. Long after Elijah was gone, children still asked questions their parents could not answer easily. Why were there places no one spoke of? Why did certain families never return? Why did some old men go silent when particular names were mentioned? Those questions mattered, they still do. Because forgetting is convenient, forgetting is profitable. Forgetting allows the world to keep moving without stopping to count the cost. Remembering demands reckoning. Remembering asks who benefited, who suffered, and who was told to be quiet about it. Elijah never believed he had won. He believed he had interrupted something. Sometimes that is all a person can do. The land where Ashcroft Fields once stood was eventually divided and sold. Houses rose where cabins had been. Children played where blood had soaked into soil. They did not know, but the earth did. The earth always remembers. Crops failed inexplicably in certain sections. Storms lingered longer than expected. Old-timers shook their heads and said the ground was troubled. They were closer to the truth than they knew. If Elijah's story survives, it is not because of the killing. It is because of the remembering. Because someone refused to let history be edited into something cleaner than it was. Because a boy who had everything taken from him decided that at least the truth would not be stolen too. That decision echoes. It echoes in every demand for justice that is dismissed as inconvenient. in every reminder that laws written after harm do not erase the harm itself, in every voice that says what happened still matters. Elijah Boone did not set out to become a legend. Legends are created by people who benefit from distance. He set out to keep a promise made in the dark to himself because it was the only thing left that belonged to him. That promise was simple: to remember. And now, because the story was told, because it was heard, because it was carried forward, instead of buried, you remember too. That is how these things survive, not through monuments, not through textbooks, through refusal, through memory, through stories that will not stay dead. Years passed in a way that no longer felt like time moving forward. It felt like time circling, revisiting the same ground with different faces. Elijah learned to measure life by seasons instead of dates, by the angle of the sun, by the way his bones ached before winter storms. He stopped counting birthdays. Numbers had never brought him anything worth keeping. He stayed away from towns when he could. Towns collected attention, and attention always came with questions. Instead, he lived. Along the edges near rivers, in broken hills, in stretches of land others avoided because there was nothing to sell there. He fixed fences for widows. He guided lost travelers without giving his name. He vanished before thanks could turn into curiosity. Sometimes he crossed paths with men who recognized something in him. Not his face, but his posture. The way his hands rested near his sides. The way his eyes tracked movement without seeming to. Those men usually kept their distance. Predators recognize other predators even when the hunt is over. Elijah did not speak of Ashcroft Fields. He did not speak of Ruth or Mary or Jonah. Those names lived inside him, preserved exactly as they were meant to be. Spoken aloud, they risked becoming something smaller, something ordinary. Silence protected them. Once, late in his life, he heard a preacher speak about forgiveness. The man talked about turning the other cheek, about mercy as weakness transformed into strength. Elijah listened from the back of the crowd, hat low, expression unreadable. When the sermon ended, the preacher asked if anyone had questions. Elijah did not raise his hand. He already knew the answer people did not want to hear. Forgiveness offered comfort to those who had not paid. Mercy sounded different when you were the one expected to grant it without ever receiving justice in return. Elijah had chosen mercy once, deliberately, carefully, and it had nothing to do with absolution. It had been a sentence, not a pardon. He left before the preacher could notice him. As his hair went gray, the world changed around him in ways that felt both dramatic and meaningless. New laws were written. Old ones were rewritten with cleaner language. People spoke about progress with confidence that bordered on pride. Elijah had lived long enough to know that progress was rarely even. It moved forward for some and sideways for others. He watched young black men learn early how to lower their eyes. He watched old white men cling to authority they no longer openly named but still enforced. He watched the same patterns repeat with different justifications. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered what his mother would think of the world that came after him. He wondered whether her belief that someone, somewhere, kept count had been naive or prophetic. He never answered the question. He did not need to, because he had kept count. When Elijah felt his strength finally leaving him, it did not frighten him. He had been preparing for absence his entire life. He chose a place near running water and laid himself down as if resting were just another skill he had learned. He thought of the canyon, of firelight, of silence that did not demand anything back. If anyone passed him that day, they did not stop. He looked like an old man sleeping beneath the sky, which is all he had ever wanted to be seen as. The land took him quietly. No marker announced who lay there. No record preserved his name. That, too, was intentional. Elijah Boone had spent enough of his life defined by what others chose to call him. He did not need a final word. What endured was not his body, it was the disturbance he left behind. A subtle shift in how some men spoke when they believed they were alone. The hesitation that crept in where certainty used to live. The understanding, unspoken, uncomfortable, that history was not as settled as people liked to pretend. Stories like Elijah's do not promise resolution, they promise remembrance. They insist that the past is not finished simply because it is inconvenient. They remind us that injustice unacknowledged does not disappear. It waits. And sometimes it walks back into town wearing black, says nothing at all, and reminds the world that God remembers. So now the story rests with you, not as entertainment, as responsibility. Because once you know, forgetting is no longer neutral, it is a choice. And Elijah Boone's life was proof that choices, once made, echo far longer than gunshots ever could. Elijah's body was never found, and in some ways that mattered more than if it had been. A body would have ended the story. It would have allowed men to point and say, "There, it is finished." Instead, there was only absence, and absence invites. Memory in ways presence never does. For a long time after he was gone, people claimed to see him. A tall black man walking the edge of a town at dusk. A figure standing near a riverbank just before a group of hired men decided to turn around and go home. A shadow on a ridgeline watching a posse argue itself into fear. None of these sightings were confirmed. None needed to be. The possibility alone was enough to make some men reconsider their choices. Elijah had learned early that fear was not created by violence itself, but by uncertainty. A whip was terrifying because you knew it was coming. A gunshot from nowhere was terrifying because you never saw it arrive. He had built his legend on that principle without ever intending to. Once the idea existed that the forgotten could return, that memory could take shape, it no longer mattered whether he was alive or dead. Time blurred the details. In some tellings, Elijah spared more men than he killed. In others, he was ruthless to the end. In some versions, he was aided by entire communities who hid him, fed him, warned him. In others, he worked entirely alone, a solitary force shaped by isolation. The truth sat somewhere in between, complicated and unsatisfying, as most truths are. What never changed was the beginning, the plantation, the whip, the child forced to watch. That was the anchor. Every version returned there eventually, because that was where the debt was incurred. Historians would later argue over whether men like Elijah could have existed without being documented. They would talk about records, census rolls, court transcripts. They would say there was no proof. What they often missed was that slavery itself thrived on incomplete records. Names were altered, ages were guessed, lives were counted only when they could be sold. Expecting clean documentation from a system built on erasure was its own kind of dishonesty. Elijah existed because systems like Ashcroft Fields existed. That was proof enough. In the quiet years after his disappearance, black families continued to pass the story down, but carefully. Children were not told everything at once. Some parts were too heavy. They were given fragments, a warning, a lesson, an understanding that history was not something safely locked behind them. It was something that breathed. White families, when they spoke of it at all, did so defensively. They emphasized chaos, lawlessness. They framed Elijah as a criminal detached from cause, a symptom rather than a response. That framing served a purpose. It allowed them to avoid asking why such a man might be created in the first place. Elijah had understood that instinctively. That was why he never explained himself. Explanations invited debate. Debate invited dismissal. Silence forced people to sit with their own conclusions. Once, an elderly woman who had known him briefly said that Elijah carried sadness the way some men carried weapons, quietly, constantly. She said he was kind in small ways that were easy to miss. He fixed things without being asked. He listened without interrupting. He never laughed loudly. When asked why he helped people when he had every reason not to, he told her that cruelty multiplied when left alone, and so did kindness. That was the closest he ever came to philosophy. Elijah never wrote anything down. No journals, no confessions. Nothing that could be found later and reduced to an artifact. He understood that words on paper could be controlled. Stories could not. Stories adapted. They slipped through cracks. They survived fires and laws and forgetting. In later decades, when new generations struggled to understand why old wounds refused to heal, Elijah's story resurfaced again. It appeared in whispers during arguments about justice and forgiveness. It appeared whenever someone asked why anger lingered long after chains were removed. It appeared when people demanded that the past stay in the past. The story answered without answering, because it was not about Elijah alone. It was about every child who learned fear before safety. Every family separated without consent. Every crime justified by law and tradition. Elijah was simply the shape memory took that one time. There were those who wished he had chosen differently, who said that mercy should have come sooner or more often, who said violence only begets violence. Elijah had never disagreed with that. He had simply understood that violence had already been it long before he picked up a gun. He did not start the fire. He walked into smoke that had been thick for generations. That distinction mattered to him, even if it never mattered to those who judged from a distance. Toward the end of his life, Elijah sometimes wondered whether the world would ever truly remember without being forced to, whether there would come a day when truth did not need a body or a legend to be acknowledged. He did not live long enough to see that answer, and perhaps no one ever will, but he knew this. Forgetting required effort. Someone had to smooth over the past. Someone had to rename it. Someone had to teach children not to ask certain questions. Remembering, on the other hand, happened naturally when stories were allowed to breathe. That was why his story survived, not because it was violent, because it was honest, and honesty has a way of unsettling people who benefit from silence. Long after Elijah Boone was gone, long after Red Hollow faded into dust and Ashcroft Fields existed only as an entry in land records, the idea he represented remained. The idea that memory could outlive power. That the oppressed were not blank slates once freed, but living archives. That history was not finished simply because it had been declared over. Elijah never claimed to be a hero. Heroes seek recognition. Elijah sought balance. He knew balance could never be perfect, never truly fair, but even an imperfect accounting was better than none at all. In the end, he left no monument. He left a disturbance, a quiet pressure beneath the surface of a nation that preferred smooth narratives. A reminder that beneath every story of progress lay stories of pain that did not vanish just because time passed, and as long as those stories are told, as long as someone listens without turning away, Elijah Boone has not entirely disappeared, because memory, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. By the time Elijah's name had dissolved into rumor, the country had learned how to speak about slavery without saying the word. People called it a tragedy, a mistake, an unfortunate chapter. They spoke as if it were weather, something that happened rather than something that was done. Elijah had lived long enough to recognize that language for what it was. Distance disguised as wisdom, comfort pretending to be maturity. He had seen how men rewrote themselves when the rules changed. Overseers became deputies, traders became bankers, plantation owners became respected elders who spoke softly about heritage. The same hands that once signed bills of sale now signed contracts and sermons. The violence did not vanish. It learned how to wear cleaner clothes. Elijah never argued with those men. Argument required faith that they were listening. Instead, he watched. He always watched. That habit had kept him alive longer than anything else. There were nights when he sat alone and replayed moments not out of guilt, but out of precision. He remembered the exact sound of the saloon door in Red Hollow, the way the room smelled of sweat and whiskey, the brief instant of recognition in Silas Crow's eyes before the shot. Elijah did not savor that memory, but he did not reject it either. It was a fact. Facts did not need forgiveness. They needed acknowledgement. He thought more often of the faces he had not killed, the men who had looked at him and understood too late that survival did not mean absolution. The ones who aged into obscurity believing themselves safe because the world had moved on. Elijah knew some of them died peacefully in their beds. That knowledge did not surprise him. History rarely delivers justice evenly. It delivers it irregularly, incompletely, sometimes not at all. That unevenness had once enraged him. Over time, it became simply another truth to carry. He understood something else as well. That had he been born white, his anger would have been called ambition. His patience would have been called discipline. His violence would have been framed as necessity. But because he was born enslaved, every response to cruelty was treated as proof of inherent danger. Elijah never needed a book to teach him how narratives worked. He lived inside one. When people spoke about him as a monster, Elijah felt no urge to correct them. Monsters, after all, were easier to dismiss than mirrors. In the rare moments he allowed himself to imagine an alternate life, it was always quiet, a small piece of land, a woman whose past did not need explaining, children who did not flinch at raised voices. That life hovered at the edge of his thoughts. Like a language he almost remembered, but imagining it too clearly felt like betrayal. The boy he had been had not been granted such choices. Elijah carried that boy with him always. He did not believe in abandoning the dead. Once, during a long drought, he worked alongside other men digging a well for a farming community. No one knew who he was. He was just another aging laborer with strong hands and few words. When the water finally broke through and spilled up from the earth, people cheered. Elijah stood back and watched their relief. He felt something then that surprised him, not joy exactly, but alignment. For a moment, effort had been rewarded. The world had responded honestly. Moments like that were rare. He held on to them. As he grew older, Elijah became increasingly aware that the story would outlive him no matter what he did. Even if he spoke, even if he denied parts of it, people would tell it as they needed to. He accepted that. Control had never been his illusion. Responsibility had been. That was why he never corrected the ending. Some said he chose mercy because he was tired of killing. Some said he spared Ashcroft because he wanted the man to suffer longer. Some said he was guided by God. Some said he was guided by madness. Elijah understood that all of those explanations were attempts to make his choice comfortable. None were necessary. He had done what felt precise. Precision was the only morality. He trusted. Toward the end, Elijah noticed how often people spoke of closure. They wanted history wrapped cleanly, tied off so it could be placed on a shelf. Closure implied that pain had an expiration date. Elijah knew better. Pain was not a story arc, it was a condition. That did not mean healing was impossible. It meant healing did not look like forgetting. If Elijah had left behind any instruction, it was this: memory does not demand vengeance. It demands honesty. Vengeance was his response to a specific moment, a specific debt. It was not a universal prescription. Those who mistook it for one misunderstood him entirely. He had never wanted followers. He wanted witnesses. In his final years, Elijah sometimes sat with children and listened to them talk. He answered their questions when they were asked honestly. When they were not, he stayed quiet. He told them stories that did not include blood. Stories about endurance, about patience, about knowing when to stand still and when to move. He did not tell them who he had been. He showed them how to observe. That, he believed, was safer. On the last morning anyone could confirm seeing him, Elijah rose before dawn and walked toward the sound of water. He moved slowly, deliberately as he always had. There was no ceremony, no speech, no sense of completion. Life rarely offered such symmetry. He lay down where the grass bent toward the river and closed his eyes. If there was fear, it passed quickly. If there was regret, it did not linger. What remained was memory, settling back into the land that had shaped him. Long after, people continued to argue about whether men like Elijah made things better or worse, whether their actions delayed reconciliation or forced it. Whether silence would have been wiser, Elijah was not there to answer. He would not have tried, because the story was never meant to resolve debate. It was meant to prevent erasure. As long as it was told, even imperfectly, something essential survived. A refusal to smooth history into something polite. A refusal to let suffering be reduced to an unfortunate abstraction. A refusal to forget the cost paid by those who never volunteered to bear it. That refusal is not loud. It does not announce itself, it persists. And in that persistence, Elijah Boone remains exactly what he always was after the boy inside him died. A reminder. That memory, once claimed, does not belong to the past. It belongs to whoever is brave enough to carry it forward.